Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in at the iLaw Lunchtime webinar series, Harnessing Drone Technology. We have created this 40-minute introductory webinar targeted for both lawyers and non-lawyers like you who are interested to learn a bit more about the drone technology in the UK. We're very pleased to have our Head of Corporate, Tony Roberts, and Robert Garbett from Drone Major Group, who will be outlining some key commercial and legal developments about the drone technologies in the UK. We'll also be having a Q&A session at the end, which our speakers will try to answer your questions live for you, and you can have the choice to participate anonymously. So Tony, would you like to start us off?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining our webinar today. We'll launch in to the legal bits, which I will cover, and then Robert Garbett from the Drone Major Group, which focuses very much on the drone sector and has played a leading part in shaping UK policy in this area, will speak about the commercial aspects, and in particular some of their new test and development initiatives, which are designed at the commercialisation of drone technology. So with the benefit, hopefully, of the joys of technology, if we turn to our slides, as I say, I will start by covering the legal aspects, and then we'll pass over to Robert on the commercial side. The background really to why a lot of businesses are using drone technology is that the environmental targets that the government has imposed upon many businesses are very stringent. The Johnson cabinet is aiming to cut carbon emissions by 78% by the middle of the next decade. That is a huge reduction in a very short space of time. And when we consider that large government projects such as HS2 and so on will take a generation or more to come to completion, achieving these objectives by 2035 is really a very taxing strategy, and will require many businesses and families in their private homes to use heat pumps to replace gas boilers, to replace cars with electric vehicles, and in their businesses to try to reduce their carbon emissions by using drones wherever possible as a low carbon form of technology. There's also a great deal of litigation and shareholder activism amongst pressure groups and other campaigners. So, for instance, infrastructure schemes such as the Heathrow proposed Terminal 3 and the Cumbrian coal mine are mired in litigation in the courts. And indeed, the Heathrow matter has gone to the Supreme Court with many more rounds of fighting of that litigation still to occur. Earlier this week, the Welsh Government, my home patch, has announced an end to all new road building programmes. As far as I know, that wasn't in any election manifesto in Wales, but it shows these hugely significant initiatives which will need to be undertaken to meet these stretching climate targets. How then can drone technology play a part in assisting your business with fulfilling its environmental strategy? It may be, for instance, if you're in the real estate sector, you can use drones to conduct thermal imaging of property and thereby lead to improvements in energy efficiency. Drones are also used extensively in fisheries, forestry, agriculture to monitor the areas, spray crops and police the environment. And as well as the environmental benefits, use of drones in hazardous areas, of course, is also beneficial from a health and safety perspective. Companies and directors have strict legal obligations when it comes to how they discharge their management functions. The Companies Act 2006 imposes a duty under statute for them to have regard to the environment and the community. It's not simply sufficient for them to maximise shareholder value. They have to be scrupulous in ensuring that they pay proper account to the impact on the environment. Larger companies in the UK, if they're listed on the stock market, have to disclose their annual emissions in their director's report. And in the States, there's a similar requirement from the SEC. And the publicity and disclosure requirements are really driving and shaping the agenda. To take an example, and we'll pick on Shell because it's big and ugly enough, as it were, to defend itself. Shell is aiming to become net zero in terms of its operations by 2050, which aligns with the Paris Climate Accord targets. It uses drones amongst its operations to detect methane emissions in its oil and gas field, and thereby avoid leakage and improve energy efficiency, as well as paying, as it were, lip service from a PR perspective. Shell has also linked the pay of many of its staff to this target to reduce the carbon intensity of its operations. And therefore, there's a direct requirement on individual employees to ensure that this target is met. I think we're moving away from companies seeing these environmental issues as being part of their looser CSR agenda, and much more scrupulous, much more hard and fast. In its AGM last month, shareholders passed a non-binding resolution to approve this climate strategy by Shell, but there was a great deal of dissent and argument at the AGM, and many shareholders wished to table a more strict set of rules on the company. We see that the institutional investor bodies such as PERC, which manages a huge amount, advises managers of pension schemes, huge sums at stake. They complained that the Shell resolution lacked individual accountability for directors, and in particular didn't list the chairman as responsible personally for the strategy. It also commented that Shell's plan was in step with society, whereas PERC said that Shell, because of the nature of its operations, should be leading society. And this shows the ratchet effect where shareholder activism will be forcing companies into ever greater moves in this area. And of course, it will cascade down from the Shells of the world to all businesses, because just as companies and just as countries rather cannot tax their way out of problems by taxing the 1%, they have to take a bigger base. So these climate change targets won't just fall on Shell and the big obvious oil and gas companies. It will fall on all businesses, large and small. And as time goes on, this ratchet effect will become increasingly clear. The pensions regulator in the UK has stated that pension funds must address climate change in their investment strategy statements. And the Law Commission has confirmed that it is lawful for trustees to take account of non-financial factors. The ABI, another large institutional investor body, of course, in the UK, has joined the UN's Environment Programme in respect of insurance. And we see that these initiatives are, to a large extent, replacing some of the carbon offsetting measures we used to see a few years ago. It's no longer sufficient for companies to churn out all of this pollution and then plant a few trees in the Amazon rainforest. Now the emphasis is much more on cutting off the carbon emissions at source, rather than what's often seen as a publicity stunt, carbon offsetting forestry initiative after the fact. So all of this points in the direction really of ever increasing emphasis on these areas, and therefore many businesses will need to exploit drone technology to reduce their emissions and meet their environmental targets. Many industries and sectors which use drone technology will involve a partnership of some sort between the public and private sectors. The UK government post-Brexit has a particular emphasis on drone and other emerging technologies as we, in the phrase, build back better. The government and UK RI have launched a future flight challenge with a relatively modest amount of funding, but hopefully material in terms of these emerging technologies, which will be designed to enable advanced electric and other clean technologies to reach critical mass. PwC did a study earlier this year indicating that the unit costs on some of the projects they studied saw reductions of between 20 and 48% in the actual costs. So of course, in terms of a balance sheet analysis, many businesses have a very direct interest from a bottom line perspective in terms of pursuing some of these drone and other new technologies, in addition to meeting the environmental targets. This future flight initiative has funded drones to support the NHS in the wake of the virus challenge. It has funded a pop-up airport that will assist in disaster recovery projects around the world. And it has looked into projects such as utilities, inspecting power lines, for example, as well as some of the more obvious transport and logistics issues for mail and cargo. Dominic Cummings, of course, now out of Downing Street, one of his pet projects was ARIA, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, which is meant to turbocharge the UK's drive into these new and emerging technologies. It's modelled on the US DARPA agency. DARPA, of course, is looking into drone technology, in particular from a defence angle, but ARIA in the UK is meant to have a more wider focus than purely defence projects. But hopefully we'll be seeing some of the benefits of this ARIA body over the next few years. A Geospatial Commission has also been set up by the government under the chairmanship of Sir Andrew Dilnot, which will aid in the monitoring of environmental change and its impact, and how geospatial data, which of course is essential for mapping areas and helping delivery services and others, many of which will employ drone technology. And whether it's self-driving vehicles, whether it's making the Ordnance Survey map open, whether it's mapping digitally all of the UK's national infrastructure, such as cabling and utility pipes and so on, that Geospatial Commission has a very wide and interesting remit, which will help drive growth in the drone sector. Supposedly, the Commission will come forward with a national location data framework for the UK by 2025, and a lot of interesting work is being undertaken by that Commission. Much of the work we do at iLaw involves joint ventures between the public and private sector. Now, of course, many of you will have worked with the public sector, and those projects have their own flavours. It's very important in the joint venture contractual documentation to split the rights and responsibilities between the public bodies and the private companies, make sure that the structure and governance of the joint venture is set up on a firm footing, deal with the funding needs both initially and for ongoing working capital requirements for the project, make sure the business plan and budget are well established and that there's an ability to change them as the project develops, and also, of course, to account for what we've called quirks in the public sector context. So it might be accountability to Parliament, the notion of being subject to freedom of information requests, and some of the wider political factors which will influence how the public sector will operate, which may not necessarily be replicated in purely private sector contexts. Some of the particular issues to focus on will be the ownership of IP, the dividend policy of any joint venture vehicle, how will money be returned to the shareholders as the project becomes successful, what proportion will be reinvested in the business, and what proportion will be distributed. What will the exit strategy be? Will the project have a set lifetime of 5 years, 10 years, or whatever it may be? Will it be open-ended? Is the aim to list the vehicle on the stock market by way of an IPO at some future stage? Might there be a mechanism for one of the parties to buy out the other? Very important to think of those, as it were, divorce scenarios at the outset when the marriage is being put together. Very important also, especially for many public sector bodies, to try to ensure that disputes which may arise are resolved in a satisfactory fashion, and preferably without recourse to the courts. Wherever possible, solving problems through mediation or arbitration will be preferable than litigation in the High Court. And also for technology disputes, London in particular has got a very good track record over the last 20 or 30 years in dealing with disputes in these emerging areas. In the case of purely private sector joint ventures, of course, many of the issues we've talked about in the context of the public sector will also be relevant, but the degree of emphasis and the angles at which the private sector partners may come at them may be very different. In the private sector context, it's especially important to make sure that funding requirements for the business are looked after properly, and it may be that that funding comes externally via a bank or another funding source, and they may take extensive security over the project, over the IP rights in the drone and other technology, and possibly even personal guarantees from directors in the business. So having access to the right levels of capital to fund these initiatives is no easy feat as the banking sector recovers from the pandemic. Very important also that the project has clear milestones and that it's clear as to which of the shareholders is in the driving seat, really, in terms of establishing when milestones have been met, because it may be that the passing of a particular milestone will trigger the making, for example, of injections of further funding or have some other consequences. So making sure that the governance of the joint venture entity is set up on a sound footing is key. Change protocols are also, of course, crucial to ensure that there's sufficient flexibility in the business to deal with future changes, and exit scenarios, which we mentioned earlier, in the private sector context, if anything, are even more crucial. And many of the projects we work on, we see effectively kitchen sink protection, where the shareholders will turn their minds to a range of potential scenarios which could go wrong with the project, and being very clear as to how the project will be wound up if and when the objectives are met, or if and when a dispute arises between partners. Other factors which will be very critical will be ensuring that the parties don't compete with each other in relation, for instance, to their wider group businesses, and also ensuring that conflicts of interest are properly dealt with. The aim, broadly speaking, will be to ensure that initiatives and business opportunities which should properly be for the benefit of the joint venture company are steered through the joint venture, and that those opportunities cannot be exploited or siphoned off by the parties into their related ventures. IP in both the initial concept and design and improvements in the technology as the project develops also need to be carefully handled. And we've mentioned previously London being a top arbitration centre. From a lawyer's closed shop perspective, we've always benefited, of course, in the UK from the legacy of English law around the world. One cautionary note that I would say is that many litigants and people involved in arbitration proceedings are not great fans of virtual hearings. Of course, in the pandemic, we've all been used to participating and viewing remote proceedings, and just as this Zoom has its wonderful benefits, they don't fully capture my charm and good looks on a screen. And by the same token, some of these virtual hearings are not, I think, as good as they should be for testing witnesses and dealing with cross-examination. I think some of the judges and practitioners from the legal side are very keen on virtual hearings, and they've been an essential commodity during the virus episode. But my personal hope is that as we move out to this phase, we go back to normal course of business for those arbitration proceedings. Singapore, in the latest figures this year, is coming very close to knocking London off the top spot. Many of the emerging economies, in particular India and China, of course, are very much shifting to the east. And I think London can't rest on its laurels in terms of hoovering up some of this top quality legal work. Hong Kong has also been punching very much above its weight in this sector, although some of the recent developments in Hong Kong may perhaps be a warning sign that its longer term prospects may not quite be as healthy. But certainly I think the legal world in London should keep a very close eye on Singapore. Mostly, of course, we've focused on the benefits of drone technology in terms of saving money, environmental benefits, and meeting commercial objectives, harnessing funding from the public and private sectors. For some businesses, of course, drones from other sources might be a risk to their business. So, of course, businesses involved in public events or with critical infrastructure will need to protect their projects and their trade secrets, etc., by way of preventing incursions from third-party drones, and they will need to have regard to the Home Office Counter Drones Unit guidance, and also that from the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office, which recommends that relevant businesses in these sectors need to develop a counter-unmanned aerial system strategy as part of their wider disaster recovery and business continuity plans. So many businesses have been, of course, reviewing how their performance is managed in the course of the pandemic, through having employees working remotely from home, the need to ensure that their customer and client data is protected, and so on. But many businesses also will need to factor in drone technology and ensuring that their business operations are protected from drone-related risks. By 2025, as part of its work, the Geospatial Commission is aiming to set clear guidelines on some of these issues around security, ethics, privacy, etc., access to data, specifically in the context of location data. But I think those state-of-the-art standards which the Geospatial Commission will set up will be very beneficial, really, for all people exploiting drone technology. Finally, we'll turn to a very brief mention of a few other issues before we hand over to Robert. As you will all have seen, the Air Traffic Management Act has now received royal assent this year. That now sets out the platform in the UK for the regulatory framework. There has been harmonisation of some of the drone-related rules affecting both the leisure sector and the commercial sector. And a framework has been set for future changes, which in very broad terms are largely expected to follow emerging EU legislation in this area, despite Brexit. The Act brings forward and codifies the system of enforcement and penalties for misuse of drones, and brings in geofencing provisions in order to protect airports from the kind of incursions we saw at Gatwick around Christmas time a few years back. Another development people may have noticed is that the Civil Aviation Authority has given its first authorization for a project for drones to operate beyond the visual line of sight. So gradually, I think this is a harbinger that drone technology will go from that very small scale operation and leisure use into more commercial applications. As I think the commercial role of drone technology becomes increasingly important, we will need to see in the UK the need for the insurance sector to expand. Currently, it's a very specialist area and very expensive with some very niche players in the market. Hopefully, the London insurance market will grow and facilitate a wider and more cost-effective system of insurance, which will in turn encourage and facilitate growth in the sector. We will now pass over to Robert, who will be speaking to us about some of the drone major initiatives. And I'm glad to say that Robert has won the gold star today for graphics and slides. So I'm sure we're in for a treat. And with that, we'll hand over, please, to Robert Garbett of the Drone Major Group.
Tony, thank you very much for the introduction and some fabulous information there. Thank you very, very much. I'm not going to be as forensic as you're going to be, but hopefully we'll just going to share my screen and take you through an introduction to what's called the Phoenix program. Now, sorry about this. Excellent. So hopefully everyone can see that. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again to iLaw for the opportunity to speak to you. Apologies for the surroundings and the possible background noise. I'm actually on my travels today, so I've had to stop somewhere to take the time to present to you. What I'm going to speak to you about today is a system which is called the Phoenix program. Back in 2018, 2019, I started an ad hoc group comprising of all the senior stakeholders within the UK drone industry. Don't worry too much about all the text on the screen. Please don't try to read it. I just know that you're going to be given this and you need the background. So we started the ad hoc group really just to try to understand why there was such a delay in a move towards proper what I call commercialization, but it is better to think about it as industrialization. Because commercialization can be construed as perhaps maybe just allowing small drone operators to use drones more freely. But actually what we're talking about is the use of autonomous and remotely controlled systems at an industrial level. That's quite an important thing to wrap your head around if you can, because that's what this is all about. So back in 2018, as a result of quite a lot of frustration, I think not only from the drone industry, but also from government and from the user community as well, that the progress towards industrialization was becoming a little bit slowing, and we seem to be repeating ourselves quite a lot in terms of some of the trials that were happening, and that's continued on. How do we get from, how do we get to a point where industry could start to use this? So we got together and it was decided that the best thing to do would be to write a white paper for government, which we then did. It was entitled The Commercialisation of the UK Civil Drone Industry, and it was issued to the UK government in July 2020. A little bit of a delay because of COVID, but that's all fine. That paper, I think, has had a fundamental impact on the way that government are doing their business and other organizations are looking at commercialization. And it's certainly had a massive impact on the way I'm running my business. One of the things that I did is step back and look at how I could solve one of those problems. And that problem being, how do we get from where we are now, which I very tongue-in-cheek called the cyclone of trials, to where we need to be, where industry understands how and when they can utilize this technology and it can start to be used commercially. So, and again, just like to take out of your head the picture of small drones being remotely operated, doing small jobs, and think about the sort of wide-scale use of autonomous and remotely controlled systems, which is the true definition of drone, across on land, sea, subsea, air, space, as a system of systems. So we really need to get to that point where industry understands. And I'll tell you why. There are two key issues with the industrialization of this technology. And one is that the drone industry and the user community, unlike in many areas of the past where the industry developing the technology and the industry that wants to use it are actually quite close together. And so the system of government giving money to companies to fully develop their technology to a high TRL, that's technology readiness level, works because the user community know what they want, what they're looking for is the next best thing, and they know what they want to use it for. And the developing community are funded by government to do that, and they're very close together. In the drone industry, unfortunately, certainly, and which is specifically acute in the aviation sector, they're way apart. So the drone industry is over here developing and testing stuff that may not even be required. Sometimes they're testing and developing stuff that we know is possible. Other times they're testing and developing things and trialing things that industry doesn't really need or want. So there's a huge gap. So I put together a program which would try to bridge that gap and slowly drag them together over time, such that in time the Phoenix program would no longer be required. So what is the Phoenix program? It is a family of interconnected projects which are designed to deliver commercially viable, this is really important, commercially viable, scalable, and environmentally sound services. We are not selling technology, we are not developing technology, we're not doing anything that anyone else has already done, and we are not trialing. What we are doing is taking the output of all that great work that's been happening over the last 6 or 7 years, and the trials that continue to go on in projects such as the Future Flight, and plugging them into something that will commercialize them. Because the problem is that, and there's nothing wrong with trialing, it is absolutely needed. Government gives money to either Catapult or UKRI. They fund trials with small companies and or consortiums. Most of the time, once that government money is over, the trial is over, and there is no client to speak of who's going to take that forward. And the reason for that is because even if you are a large FTSE 100 company, and even if you are the Amazons of the world and the BTs of this world, once you get to the point where the trial has ended and you take the lid off that can, which is how do we scale this up, you very quickly put it back on, because the scope of work required to fully commercialize this technology is vast, and it is way too big for any one company or even a small consortium to look at. So it has to be approached in a much larger way in order to spread the risk and spread the cost. And that is essentially what the Phoenix program aims to do. In terms of its benefits for industry, it gives them a clear pathway to the operational capability they want. It is not an instant hit. We're not going to start industrializing immediately, but there are some steps. So is it trialing? No. Is it piloting? Yes, but with a long-term strategic vision for full commercialization, which means that we'll be able to charge for the services that we are delivering. It means that the user community no longer have to deal with the Wild West of the drone industry, which is, again, tongue-in-cheek, but there's lots of companies out there claiming to be able to do all sorts of things. And of course, if they've trialed them and it's proven to be done, that's great. But there's a huge difference between trialing and commercial delivery, massive difference. And many of this is acutely obvious in the what's called the eVTOL or UAM industry, where people are trialing these systems and they're, yeah, it's great, and you get clearance to do that. But the likelihood of you getting a passenger carrying system in the air with no pilot on board is zero for the next 15 to 20 years. So whilst investors are being sold, a bit of a pipe dream, the reality is you can't commercialize that. And I'm not interested in that. What we're interested in is what can we use now and how can we develop that process so that in the time industry is able to use the full range of this technology. It means that you've got one organization to deal with that'll look after all the technological and legislative issues. And also, of course, it helps the CAA because they've got one organization to deal with when it comes to looking at the problems and the blockers that we will no doubt reach. On top of that, we decided very, very early on that this could not be government funded. Government funding is very stop-start. Government funding creates chasms. And what we need to do is make sure that this is a commercial project funded by industry and funded by investors. So that's where we started. Who's involved? Well, our approach is to engage with very key stakeholders in the user community. And each project that we have created, and there are 10 now in the UK, we do not engage initially with the drone industry at all, other than the expertise that we have within the network of consultants that we have globally. What we're looking to do is to engage with the user community. So we engage with either on a regional or an industry level. What are the problems? Could they be commercialized? How do we solve them? Let's create a scoping and implementation plan. Then let's start looking at what exists currently within the industry to be able to deliver that. And at the same time, as you can see on the right-hand side, this set of logos represents probably 10% of the companies and organizations involved in just one of the Phoenix programs. But I've put it up there because it just shows the breadth and the scale of the sort of people involved. The point to note is there that Catapults and UKRI are fully engaged with this because they recognized that their responsibility is to get a company to a high TRL level, that's technology readiness level. And at the end of the day, they're very excited about being able to plug that company into a Phoenix that is looking to commercialize. So this is if you can think about what's going on now, which is pretty much all you may be aware of, the trialing that's going on, the government funding that's going on to enable that trialing, that will stop at some point. Okay, this is the next step. This is where the output of all those trials that have happened over the last 6 years goes. So we engage with the stakeholders, we develop what's called a roadmap with them, we agree the applications that could be commercialized, we agree the roadmap to deliver those, and then we get on and do it. And each of these programs, or each of these projects is at least a 5 to 7 year project. So it really does, it answers pretty much everyone's questions. The drone industry benefits because it comes out of developing its technology to a high TRL with Catapults and UKRI, who are doing a fantastic job. And of course, in the future, we'll be able to reduce some of the duplication by feeding in real world problems. We need this unblocked. Please trial that. Get government money from government, give it to company to develop that, or give it to university to create that, the solution to that problem. So it also benefits the user community because it gives them a clear pathway. It also benefits government because there's no point continually pouring money into R&D, hoping that eventually it sparks off, because it won't, not in this instance. Okay, this is probably the most important slide in the presentation. And this just shows you graphically, it's a little bit out of date because there are now 10 of these Phoenix programs, but it doesn't matter, projects, but it doesn't matter. Essentially what it shows you is the operational model of the Phoenix program. Each Phoenix is different, and I'll show you the 10 Phoenix projects in a moment. Each Phoenix has a separate focus. It's either regional or it's industry, but each Phoenix, there are some overlaps, but the overlaps exist for a very good reason. Each one is its own company, each one has its own SPV, each one has its own investors potentially, but they are wrapped in a common operational model which links them all together. And as you'll see in the center there, we have a common steering committee. Each Phoenix has its own steering committee, and they feed into a master steering committee, whose job is to identify every single issue and lesson learned, or lesson identified, turn it into a lesson learned, share it with all of the Phoenix programs, as well as the regulators and the standards makers. And that would be the committee at the BSI, which I chair, and then going on to influencing the International Standards Organization. It has common financial oversight, common governance, common controls. We have organizations such as the BSI who are aware of what we're doing, plugged into this, as well as the ISO, world-class teams, and it has been digitized as well. Around the outside, we've wrapped a code of conduct, which means that we're not just doing the right things for shareholders to make money, we're actually just doing the right thing. And that includes involving the education community in a two-way communication. So not only are we taking great advantage of the research they're doing, and I can tell you now, about 4 weeks ago, I had a professor from Liverpool University almost in tears when he realized that the research he was going to do would actually be used, whereas normally it was being done to satisfy a grant, put on a shelf, and never to be seen again. So there is a great deal of benefit in doing what we're doing. We're also making sure that we're operating to the highest standards, which is why we're employing all of the current and we will be looking at the future International Standards Organization's standards for this, and making sure that it is all driving towards sustainability. And pretty much every project that we have has decarbonisation written through the core of it. Okay, so let's look at the separate projects. Phoenix 1, which is the Liverpool City region, that is the entire Liverpool City region, the application of autonomous and remotely controlled systems in many areas, including environmental monitoring and testing, very large logistics, heavy lift logistics, and we're talking about 160, 350 leading up to a ton over the next few years, lift capability. We're looking at security issues, and that's asset tracking and management for some of the largest energy companies in the area, as well as some offshore. All the port operations and the offshore port operations, safety operations for Peel ports as well. So a huge amount going into there. And the logistics is not just urban logistics using air, it's also maritime logistics using autonomous vessels, and how we can then connect systems together. So how we can link what we're doing with air to what we're doing on the rail networks and on the road networks. So this is a very long-term, very large project. Phoenix 2, which was a splinter from Phoenix 1, weirdly enough, which has also given birth to Phoenix 3, but we'll come back to that. Phoenix 2 is forestry and agriculture. And so what we're looking at here is how can we utilize autonomous remotely controlled systems for the agricultural industry. On this particular project, we're focusing on initially the requirement for elms. So this is the way in which subsidies are now governed for landowners and farmers. And that's a very big project, and we've partnered with Harper Adams University on that, as well as a number of very large agricultural youth organizations. Phoenix 3, which was Carlisle Airport heavy lift, has now been, the old Phoenix 3 has now been merged with Phoenix 10. Phoenix 3 has now been taken over by carbon verification. So there are huge issues. And Tony, thank you very much for covering the importance of the use of this technology in the carbon market. Essentially, at the moment, most biomass verification is conducted using satellite technology, and really it's using open source data, which is not very high resolution. So it's great to say there is a forest here, and roughly we can do some analysis and some guesswork essentially on what the biomass of that forest is, based on a known small area that we have tested by hand. What this does then, and if they want to verify that, they're having small drone operators doing short bits and pieces. What this does is provides a layer in between, which is an absolute verification. So it's not using satellite technology, it's using air-based autonomous systems to gather far more data using LiDAR technology and other sensors to get a lot of data regarding the biomass and the health and all those kind of things that are required. Can't go into too much detail, but essentially that's a project that's now taken on. The proof of concept project will hopefully be in East Africa and we are working on that now. That's very exciting. Phoenix 4 is offshore wind. We've partnered with the Renewable Offshore Energy Catapult, and we're looking at what services that we can provide to the offshore wind industry. This is an industry that's incredibly complicated. It has, throughout its life cycle, a wind farm will have 3 or 4 owners. So the sort of the desire to purchase technology and fund things or fund innovation is pretty low. They know that this is great technology, and they know that at the moment the use of UAS is not cost effective because one man standing on a thing has to be monitored by several others. It's dangerous work, it's at sea, and of course that drone can only stay up for 20 minutes, 30 minutes. It's not exactly the most effective way of using this technology. So how do we get from where we are to where we need to be? And that's where Phoenix 4 comes in, taking the output of all these projects, the output of all the research, and also the needs of an industry which cannot, weirdly enough, because of anti-competition rules, they cannot actually collaborate. So, but they can collaborate through a third party. So that's what we intend to do. Phoenix 5 is a project that we launched to assist the police in the UK to understand how autonomous remote control systems could be used for law enforcement. And we've done a number of pieces of work for various police forces around the country, looking at the most cost-effective and effective way of using systems in maritime and land environments and air environments as well, which is great. Phoenix 6 was created actually at the request of part of the NHS, but really it's looking at going behind the great work that Southampton University are doing to see what areas of NHS logistics could be commercialized, whilst deeper research needs to be done into the use of it for things like short life cancer treatments. In addition to that, there was a huge transformation project going off in the NHS now, driven by those companies that already have contracts with the NHS. And what we're trying to do is work with them to ensure that when the transformation is done, the technology that they need is in place to enable them to do that. So that's a very long-term project that we're working on. Phoenix 7, which is a project that I've been working on for about 5 years, with a desire to try and clean plastics out of our inland waterways, estuaries, and coastal areas. It's almost impossible to commercialize that. However, we have now created a project which will absolutely commercialize it. It enables us to turn plastics back into usable bio-oil, which can either be burnt again or used back in the plastics environment, really maximizing the return on what we're doing. And what we're doing is a land-based project which will provide the funding to enable us to clean up the waterway. So it's kind of working in a way that makes it commercially viable, creating a commodity to then fund something that is not exactly, it's more altruistic than it is commercial. So that's Phoenix 7. Phoenix 8, we're working at the moment with Biggin Hill Airport, looking predominantly at airspace modernization over London. And we're also speaking to the mayor's office there as well. Lots of interest in this project. It's looking at advanced air mobility. So that's the sort of passenger carrying piloted VTOL, which I'm sure if you've heard me speak before, you'll understand that I believe that this is technology that is essentially an evolution of a helicopter, not an unmanned system, because it's going to take a very, very long time before you see anything unmanned carrying passengers. And even if you do, I think the biggest problem you're going to have is finding someone to pay to sit in the back. But anyway, that's what we're looking at, as well as some strategic logistics. 9 is traffic management and transport. We're working with a number of areas in the UK, regional local authorities in the UK on that. And 10 is a little bit secret. Let's just call it inter-regional logistics, but it's basically a Southwest project looking at a very complicated logistics program. I've just been told to wrap up because I've obviously been going on for way too long. But anyway, this whole project, the program, is a huge opportunity for the UK. It is a huge opportunity for the UK government and for the drone industry and for the user community. If you want to find out any more about this, then please do not hesitate to go to phoenixmajor.co.uk or contact me. I'd be very happy to answer any questions you've got. And at that point, as I've been told to wrap up, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Tony, for your presentation. And we will now take questions. Please use the Q&A button to submit your questions, and our speakers will try to answer them live for you. And while we're waiting for your live submissions, we have some previously submitted queries that I have here. And there's one question for you, Robert. There seem to be lots of separate initiatives from the government, but do you feel that this amounts to a proper joined up strategy to develop the drone sector? Sorry, but I think you're on mute.
Apology. So essentially, the Phoenix program was created to pull everything together. And I know it's not a government project, but it's a government-backed project. And I don't think we've had any, in fact, and I know we haven't had any conversations ranging from number 10 downwards that hasn't said, wow, that's just brilliant. And I have had conversations with the Regulatory Horizons Council, who were established to look at how we commercialize this industry, and who are delighted that we're already doing it. So the government is joined up in its thinking, but it's moved a little bit slower than industry has moved. So I think the approach that government have taken up till now, I don't think it can be criticized, because it is the way governments work with the funding of innovation. That is, you can't suddenly, just because it's the drone industry, change the way they work. But this is such a fundamentally different industry. It took industry to take hold of it and say, hey, actually, we need to do this as well. So testing and trialing, all great, but unless you do this, we're still going to be here in 10 or 20 years' time. Because if you think back to the evolution of any kind of serious technology you can think of, it takes a huge amount of time. And you've got people now driving desperately to get flying cars in the air, which is not going to happen, by the way. But who are trying to push this as quickly as possible. The only way to do that is either government carries on throwing huge amounts of money into R&D for a very long time, or we do something like the Phoenix program, which brings all that together. And as I said to you right at the very start, the Phoenix program is destined to not be required in time. It will create companies that are commercially viable, that will operate for a very long time, and it will make a lot of money for the people who invest in it. But as a concept, to bridge that gap, it will not be required forever.
Thank you, Robert. And we have a different question for you, Tony. The question is, obtaining funding for new technology projects can be often difficult, especially for businesses which are not well established. Do you think that the banks and other sources of funding are being flexible enough?
Well, the short answer, Bonnie, is probably not.
No.
As Robert has talked about, some of these projects are long-term initiatives. We were talking 5 to 7 years. And many of the banks, of course, will be looking at shorter term. And although some of the challenger banks, I think, are getting into this market and are a little bit more adventurous, perhaps, than some of the staid larger banks, we still find post-pandemic, post-Lehman Brothers, even 10 plus years ago, I think banks are very stringent. The amount of security they take over these sorts of projects, the impact they have in terms of consultation and development of projects, they're very hands-on, they're very directive and controlling. So finding that balance between having the commercial freedom to develop a project whilst meeting the bank's strictures is very difficult. Some of the organizations, the venture capital organizations, private equity investors are better bets. But again, the finance for all of these projects is very difficult. And hopefully we will see through the commercialization and industrialization of the Phoenix programs. I think as people see the real world application of these projects at scale and being commercially attractive and going from that initial testing small entity stage, let's hope that more of the funding comes on stream and more of the major institutions and the larger banks start to, as it were, loosen the purse strings, because the UK has great potential in this sector. Currently, the banks, perhaps understandably, are not being as flexible as they might be, but hopefully as the technology develops, as the Phoenix programs come to fruition, let's hope, as I say, that the banks will start to open the checkbooks a little bit more freely to fund the innovation that we can harness in the UK in this fantastic sector, and take the opportunities over the next 10, 20 years to really be a world leader in this space.
Thank you,
I can add a little
Tony.
bit, if I may, just very, very quickly, is that, thank you, Tony, that's absolutely spot on. We have, whilst we are not asking government for money, we are asking government to encourage investment in this, because the traditional, as you say, Tony, the traditional VC investment, you have to have that kind of proven track record. And this is something that's never been done before. So it has to open up. And each of these projects, to get to a point where you have a viable roadmap, because we fund phase 1, 2, and 3 right up to the point where you have a viable roadmap, costs over £200,000. And then it's down to individual investors to get the next phase, which gives us everything we need to then get the investment beyond that. So it is an arduous journey. And what we want government to do is to start encouraging investment more beyond what it already does with SEIS and EIS into this particular technology, because it is going to take a bit of a punt.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you everyone for participating in this live webinar. And if you have any questions on drone application in businesses that you would like to discuss with our speakers, you can email them directly, and the email addresses can be found on the agenda. We'll also be sending out a feedback form to you shortly, and it will be great if you can just spend 2 minutes of your time filling it in so we can tailor make these webinars for you. If you would like to rewatch this webinar or send it to your colleagues, this webinar will be made available shortly on YouTube. So make sure you follow us on LinkedIn to get updates about it and other future upcoming webinars. Thank you so much for participating, and we hope to see you again soon on the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.